there's been a lot of concern among NATO allies about what Trump would do if he did get into the White House again. He's got quite a strange view on the crisis in the Ukraine. He's suggested quite recently, actually, at campaign events, that Ukraine could have ended the war very early on after Russia invaded, and that Ukraine's basically all destroyed and the people are all dead and there's not much left to fight for. And he thinks that there should be a peace deal. He said that he can get a deal between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours of becoming president. And that's made allies very nervous because obviously they want to continue supporting Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to have to give up swathes of territory to Russia. And all indications are that Trump would agree to giving up Ukrainian territory to Putin.
So Larisa, 10 days in the job for Mr. Rutte. Your interview came on the same day he met with Sir Keir Starmer and Ukrainian President Zelensky. Can you tell us about the interview and what was Mark Rutte like?
Yeah, so he's taking a tour of European capitals, and this was his first trip in the job to meet Keir Starmer. And it so happened that President Zelensky was here as well, so all three of them had this meeting in Downing Street. And I've interviewed Stoltenberg several times. This is the first time that I'd interviewed Rutte. He seemed quite comfortable in the job. You know, this is a man that's been prime minister for more than a decade, and he knew how to sort of handle the questions. He got a bit uncomfortable with some of the Donald Trump questions, actually, as I'm sure you'll hear. But he spoke very eloquently about sort of the main issues that you'd expect him to talk about as NATO Secretary General.
He was quite positive about being able to work with Mr. Trump. What's behind the wariness from some NATO allies about a second Trump presidency?
Yes, he was saying that he believed that Trump would basically continue support to Ukraine, and he suggested that Trump would remain part of NATO because he was saying that America can't go it alone, that America needs to be part of an alliance like NATO. And he felt pretty positive about a future relationship with Trump, as he did with Kamala Harris. And of course, the sort of background to all of this is there's been a lot of concern among NATO allies about what Trump would do if he did get into the White House again. He's got quite a strange view on the crisis in the Ukraine. He's suggested quite recently, actually, at campaign events, that Ukraine could have ended the war very early on after Russia invaded, and that Ukraine's basically all destroyed and the people are all dead and there's not much left to fight for. And he thinks that there should be a peace deal. He said that he can get a deal between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours of becoming president. And that's made allies very nervous because obviously they want to continue supporting Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to have to give up swathes of territory to Russia. And all indications are that Trump would agree to giving up Ukrainian territory to Putin. And also there's a lot of nervousness about Trump's views on spending. Obviously, at the moment, the NATO target's 2%, and Trump has suggested that he wants that to increase to 3%. But he's also warned allies that if they don't meet the 2% target, then he's suggested that they should then be open to an invasion by Putin, basically. So I think that Rutte's main priority coming to London was to downplay any suggestion that Trump would rip apart NATO and make it clear that he feels that he can work with him well.
Mr. Rutte gave a bit of a chuckle when you mentioned this tag, the Trump whisperer, that he is sometimes given. How did he get this title of Trump whisperer?
Yes, so this was in about 2018, I think, and they were in this meeting. He was obviously the Dutch Prime Minister, and they were in this NATO meeting, and I think Trump got a bit angry about defence spending during that meeting. And so Rutte sort of weighed in and made it clear to Trump that actually he'd managed to persuade allies to increase defence spending, and he should be praised for that. And I think a lot of people felt that he managed to handle Trump quite well. And so that's what got him this name of the Trump whisperer. And yes, as you're right, when I asked him about this, he did laugh. He suggested that he obviously hadn't come up with that himself, but he did say that he had a good relationship with a good working relationship with Trump. Actually, I asked if he was friends with him, if he considered himself a friend. He didn't want to go there on the friendship point. He said he only had made a few friends during his time as prime minister, but he did say that he had a good working relationship with Trump.
So MH17 was the airliner shot down over Ukraine by a Russian rocket. What's your sense, Larisa, as to how that affair might colour Mr. Rutte's dealings with President Putin and Russia?
I think he's probably come away from that thinking that, you can't really trust necessarily what the Russians say. And also just aware of the sort of gravity of the situation and what could face other countries. That it's not just all about Ukraine, it's also Putin does pose a threat to other allies, obviously allies in NATO. And he was saying that what he'd learned from MH17 was that basically you can't just operate on your own, that you need allies. And he was saying that he spoke to President Obama during that time when he was going through obviously a really difficult situation because nearly 200 of his citizens had been killed, and he managed to ring up Barack Obama, but he could also ring up his friends in Estonia, and he was saying that no matter how big or small you are as a country, you need to have allies. And again, he actually brought that back himself to Donald Trump, that the idea that Trump can't be isolationist, that America does need all of these partners.
One thing that stood out to me from Mark Rutte's answer to you just before, he said the US can't go it alone. Is that perhaps sending a signal to a United States that some fear is turning inwards?
Yes, I think that's what quite a lot of people are a bit nervous about, because everything Trump suggests points to the fact that he would become more isolationist. I mean, even if you just take the example of Ukraine, he keeps saying this line about how Zelensky is this great salesman, the greatest salesman in history, because he comes to America and then he manages to walk away with tens of billions of pounds to help Ukraine fight Russia. And just by saying that, he's suggesting that he wouldn't give that support to Zelensky, and therefore he wouldn't help Ukraine defeat Russia. And I think a lot of his support base question, why is America getting involved in these faraway wars? Trump likes to also repeat this idea that under his presidency previously, there were no wars, soldiers weren't fighting overseas. He set out to end everything going on in Afghanistan. And he wants to focus on life at home for many Americans and help with the economic situation. He doesn't want to have Americans engaged abroad in wars that he doesn't think they should be fighting.
You asked Mr. Rutte whether he expected a war between Russia and NATO. What did he have to say on that?
He said that he didn't expect a war in the coming years because he felt that NATO was strong enough to deter Putin from wanting to engage in a war. Obviously in that same vein, he was saying that NATO allies do need to spend more, however, to make sure they've not got capability gaps. But then we sort of got onto the topic of Putin's threats about using nuclear weapons. And he said that he believed that Putin wouldn't use nuclear weapons because he knew that NATO would respond very strongly. And actually, then I asked him what would NATO do, because there's a big question here. If Putin didn't use nuclear weapons inside Ukraine, what would NATO's response be, and what does Putin think NATO's response would be? And he didn't answer that. And it is a bit unclear, because if he did use nuclear weapons, and NATO did then respond quite strongly, then you could end up in getting involved in World War III with nuclear weapons being involved, and that's a pretty terrifying prospect for NATO allies. And so I would be interested to know a bit more about what are the options on the table for NATO allies. But yes, he didn't want to be forthcoming with that for obvious reasons. I think it's to be expected. Britain said that they're going to increase their defence spending to 2.5%, but they've not told us when they're going to do this. And the UK, in sort of going to a lot of these meetings has also been persuading NATO allies to also have that ambition to reach that 2.5% target. But then Trump, interestingly, his campaign team have suggested that he would want to reach 3% instead. And so I think Rutte needs to make clear that he agrees with the general principle that allies need to spend more. He didn't want to be drawn on whether that was 2.5% or 3%. But I think he sees it as a direction that everybody's going, and the threats are getting worse. And therefore, it makes total sense to tell allies, let's set a new target, because the 2% target that was set several years ago just isn't going to be enough anymore.
So 15 years, the last couple of NATO Secretaries General have been from Scandinavia. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, Jens Stoltenberg. What's your sense of how Mark Rutte from the Netherlands, how his approach will differ from theirs? Is NATO going to change?
I don't get any sense it will dramatically, actually. I think, he's a very professional politician. He is a safe pair of hands. He's like Stoltenberg in the sense that, he isn't caught out by any questions, and he knows he can't step over the line. He knows what he's able to talk about and what he isn't. So I don't see a dramatic change in direction for NATO. I think he's got quite a lot of things to deal with going forward, because there is this division over the supply of Storm Shadow to the Ukrainians, the long-range weapons for them to use inside Russia. So that's something that's going to have to be decided upon over the next few months, as a division between the US and the UK. And he's also going to have some sort of response to what's going on in the Middle East, because of course that's taking up a hell of a lot of effort from the part of the Americans, and obviously the Brits are helping Israel to some extent as well. And then he's got China to look at as well in the future. There's a lot of concern about the rise of China and what China's doing with Russia, North Korea and Iran, and how they're working together. And so I think he's going to have a new set of challenges, but I think generally he's going to take NATO forward in sort of the same way as Stoltenberg.
You mentioned that division with the UK potentially. One other story you've been reporting this week is that the UK is considering sending military trainers, British soldiers, into Ukraine to train troops there. And that's prompted warnings from some that mustn't be seen as a NATO operation, because that may kind of cross one of the Russian red lines. Did Mr. Rutte have anything to say about that?
He said that there wasn't any plans for NATO as a whole to carry out training inside Ukraine. So basically, it's up to Britain. And the British military chiefs have been discussing this for a while, and the Ukrainians hope that if the UK takes a leading role on this, then countries like France might follow suit. So you might end up with a few countries doing this training inside Ukraine. But yes, Rutte kind of made it quite clear, actually, that it wouldn't be a NATO mission, as probably the Ukrainians hope it would be.
Larisa, thank you. That's Larisa Brown, the Times' defence editor.